Guys, it's your favorite reactor, Senpai Reacts, and we're watching BABYMONSTER SHEESH performance video. If you're new, make sure you subscribe, like, comment below under the video, and let's get straight into the video.
Baby, I'm a monster. Mona and Mona, I see you in slow-mo. You know you're in trouble. 밟아, 둥쳐봐. 어차피 손바닥 위에서 못 나가. You know that. 눈을 뜬 순간 피어나. All eyes on me. 불을 질러라. Do or die. All my life. Yeah, you ain't seen nothing yet. Got them all going. Sheesh, 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 sheesh. Yeah, everyone am on hand. Sheesh, 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 sheesh. Yeah, got them all going. Yeah, hold on. 깐들이 보라니 달팽이 보네. 이건 네 뒤에 줄 축복. 음악에 맞춰 그냥 춤춰. 히비리 핫밥 뿡뿡 파우. 분위기 타올라 니들 눈 돌아. 땡하네 적전에 충격일 거야. From the screen 홈런은 쳤고 내 다음은 위. 어중이 to중이 중간 아니. 나보고 다쳤더니.
Such a good song. This song is so good. I remember it took me a while to react to the music video, but like all I've been seeing people post about it, how good it was, just such a person reacted to it, and I was seeing clips and like teasers for it, but I was just waiting till I got a chance to react to it, and now I'm here, and it's such a good song.
You know what it is, everybody this pull up in a ghost, pick up, boo-hoo. Vroom, vroom, 니네 심장이 박등에 pop, 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 pedal to the metal. Click, clack, click, put 'em up to the sky, high, high. 피어나, all eyes on me, 불을 질러라. Do or die, all my life. Yeah, you ain't seen nothing yet. Got them all going. Sheesh, 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 sheesh. Yeah, the ABYMON. Sheesh, 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 sheesh. Yeah, got them all going. 마음껏 웃어봐. 이제 내 차례니까 천천히 불태워 네가 잠든 사이. Time's up. 올라가 더. 꼭대기로. 하늘 위로. Fly away. 온 세상을 뒤집어 엎어. Let's ride. Baby, I'm a monster.
Bruh, that beat switch into that chorus is just so tough, bruh. It is so tough. BABYMONSTER SHEESH performance video. This video is fire. Just like the music video was really good. So if you're new, make sure to subscribe, like, comment below any video suggestions you have. If you would like to see more for BABYMONSTER, just let me know. And this your favorite K-pop reactor, Senpai Reacts.